This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Okay, I might get you to start just by introducing yourself, telling me about what you do.
Yeah, my name is A.B. Bishop and I'm the horticultural editor of Gardening Australia magazine and also the author of a few books about native plants and animals.
And you are based in?
Based in a place called Bend of Islands, which is about 45 minutes out of Melbourne, and we're in the bush on the Yarra River.
You are indeed on the river, and I don't know if it's going to pick it up, but you can actually hear it, can't you, from your garden?
Yeah, there's quite a few sets of rapids between us and Warrandyte, which is one of the closest towns, and they're absolutely beautiful, and you can hear the river constantly.
Yeah, it's an amazing spot. So you are in remind me what it's called?
Environmental living zone. Yeah, so it's classified as a special use zone / environmental living, and essentially what that means for us in this area is we aren't allowed to have fences and no cats or dogs are permitted, so it's all about protecting the local flora and fauna. And we must plant Indigenous plants, so those that are really local to our area. And we're allowed a kitchen garden. So we can have some other plants in pots, but I certainly am very careful not to plant those that would be weedy in this bushy area. Should be a problem.
Yeah. Does anyone actually come around and check?
No one comes around and checks. I feel like maybe they should, because sometimes you go to other people's places and they have, a number of non-native plants. But I'm of the belief that if they're contributing in some way positively to the environment, then that is better than if people don't have plants at all.
And in terms of how you manage your garden, are there certain things restricting what you cut down, for example?
Absolutely. So you basically can't cut anything down, which can be a bit of a problem because we're in a high fire risk area. So there is a plant called Kunzea, which is extremely high in oil and has really small leaves. So it's really, really flammable. In fact, it's so flammable that in the middle of winter, I use it as a fire starter just straight off the bush. So it's extremely flammable. But yes, we are prohibited from cutting down the native plants.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the wildfires, so this area is at risk from fires?
Absolutely, yeah. It's extremely dense bush, eucalyptus woodland, so lots and lots of different eucalyptus, acacias, which aren't so high in oils in their leaves, but will still burn pretty quickly. So yeah, very high risk area.
So tell me about the sort of wildlife that you find in your garden.
Well, you sort of use the term garden quite loosely because you're planting plants that will support the local wildlife, but of course then the local wildlife comes and eats all your plants, so it can be a bit of a tricky situation to try and get a decent garden. But we have got all sorts of critters here which really make up for any plants going missing, which they always do. So we have a wombat, a resident wombat, which we call Wendy, and she often comes with her joey. Every couple of years she'll have a new joey and we'll see that sort of develop in her pouch. So Wendy is around quite a lot. We have brush-tail possums and ring-tail possums. We have brush-tail phascogyles. And we have wallabies. We have roos from time to time, but because it's very bushy, you tend to not get the roos as much as the wallabies. So the wallabies are quite adept at getting around in really bushy areas, whereas the roos prefer the sort of more open paddocks, those sorts of things. We have echidnas. We have lots of different birds. We have things like eastern spinebills, pardalotes, little wrens, which you've seen hopping around. So there's an absolute gamut of wildlife, and there's always something going on with different birds and other animals.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a stunning spot. I can't think of a garden that I've been in where I've felt more instantly at home. Actually, it's a really perfect place. So you're a champion of wildlife gardening, I think it's fair to say.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm very much a believer that we can have our gardens for ourselves and for wildlife. I certainly garden for wildlife. So anything that I put in, is going to benefit wildlife in some way. And I think because we have to plant Indigenous plants, they do have that automatic connection because they have grown in the area for millennia. So they have those ecological links with the insects and the birds and the other critters. So I'm such a strong believer that we can still have a beautiful garden and not at the expense of wildlife.
Can you get creative with pruning or how you plant so that it becomes less wild looking and more formal, if that's your thing?
100%. So the thing with native plants, I mean, we have over 24,000 species. So there's a lot of plants to play with, a lot of trees, shrubs, ground covers, and they can be developed into any particular style. So a lot of the plants, if you think things like coastal rosemary, which is Westringia, and they're quite naturally dense and they can be pruned into topiary balls. So absolutely, you can develop plants, native plants, in a way that suits your particular style of gardening. So I prefer to put my plants in and just let them be and let the animals do what they need to do with them. So I don't sort of try and create particular shapes or a particular style of garden as such. I'm just growing the plants for the animals. I do try and put them in particular areas. So I do have some sort of design ideas in my head, but you could certainly, if you wanted to develop a more cottage style garden, for example, or that typical sort of Japanese style look, you can absolutely train your plants in those ways.
Do you think if you tried to have a particularly sort of formal space in this garden that it might be problematic with the wildlife?
No, I actually don't think so, because with a formal garden, it's more about the pruning and controlling the plants. So I would use those plants which are naturally dense and prune them appropriately. I still feel like if you have water in your garden, regardless of whether you have a formal garden or whatever, if you're using native plants and you have water, you are going to be bringing in the critters.
Yeah. So I don't know how popular native plants are with Australian gardeners, but I've got a sense of it, I think, since I've been here. I think perhaps they could be more popular. Why do you feel maybe that they're not at the moment?
I feel like that they are growing in popularity, and they're growing in popularity as people get to know them. It's like anything. When you're planting your own garden, you want to grow plants that you know how they will perform. You might have seen them and appreciated them in your parents' garden or grandparents' garden. But the more we showcase native plants and show people how beautiful they are, how unique they are, and how well suited they are to Australian conditions, the more people are going to be interested and encouraged to grow them. But I honestly feel like there are so many more people who have the knowledge of and interest in Australian plants now than, maybe even 5-10 years ago. And that is because they're getting to know them more. Councils are using them in their council plantings, in the roadside verges and roundabouts and amenity planting. So they're being used. People see them and are making those links between the environment, the importance of having native plants to keep the insect population thriving, and which, of course, then has that flow-on effect to every other critter.
So if you were to use them in a formal planting scheme or in a designed area and you were using Australian natives, is it conceivable that you'd see them, at the side of the road? Are you using those sort of plants? Or is it more likely that you're using natives that are kind of more showy, I suppose?
Well, the thing is, wherever you are in Australia, there is such a huge diversity of native plants that you can use both. And a lot of plants, no matter where you go in the world, aren't showy year round. So there are some here like Banksias, which when they're in flower, they're just absolutely incredible. And if you don't deadhead them, those flowers will remain on the plant, die, and be utilised by a different group of animals. So I feel like yeah, there's a good balance between those native plants which are really showy that you'd want to have in your garden, and then there's also, I suppose, the more average ones, which are sort of the everyday performers, which are still important to have in your garden but don't shine year round.
Yeah. So going back to what you were saying about planting with natives, they're more resilient, I guess, and that's going to help wildlife because you're reducing the use of water and you're reducing any other inputs you have to put in to keep them going.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have to remember Australia is huge. So when you compare it to Europe, for example, there's a lot of countries that could potentially fit into Australia. So plants that are indigenous to the Melbourne area where I am are going to be very, very different from those that are from Darwin, for example, in Northern Territory. So right up the top of Australia. So very different plants and different climate that they come from, and they have evolved in different ways. So the plants have definitely evolved with our climates and with our soils, and you do find that they're much more resilient. When you plant them, of course you will water them to establish them. You want to develop that really good root system to get them going. And a lot of people think with native plants, they have this bit of a reputation that, oh, you don't need to water them, you don't need to prune them. But if you want your plants to look good in your garden, of course you do. You've got to give them that bit of TLC. But because they are meant to grow in this area, once they're established, yeah, they absolutely don't need nearly as much water. In fact, my garden here, through summer, we've had an incredibly hot and unusual summer in Melbourne. And I have put the soaker hose on a couple of times in a couple of areas. I don't think I actually would have had to, but I did just to sort of get those plants through. But absolutely, I mean, I plant a garden thinking that I'm not needing to water it.
Brilliant. So how can you help people overcome their fear of things getting chewed? Because like you said, if they're native, they're food stuff. So
yeah, that is a really tricky one because as we were talking about, if you are planting your native plants for wildlife, you essentially want something to eat it because that's what you're planting it for. But I often, like when I put new plants in the ground, new seedlings, I'm like, guys, the wallabies, etc., can you just leave it alone for 6 months and let it establish, and then you can eat it all you want. Sometimes that doesn't always happen, but you end up putting cages around things to protect them. But in terms of insects eating them, I mean, in a way, you want your plants to be eaten by insects. It's only when they start completely defoliating a plant that it becomes a problem. And where I am in the bush, if a seedling is being defoliated by some caterpillar, I can always cut that branch off and move it to a mature native plant so that they can go and have a munch over there rather than on the new plant.
Yeah, good idea. So is anybody doing this in a really clever way that you think, yeah, they're a good example to follow for inspiration?
Yeah, so in terms of designers?
Yeah, or people that are doing it on a home garden scale?
Well, Emmeline Bowman is a landscape designer in Melbourne, and she designs from a habitat point of view, and her gardens are all using native plants and concerned about wildlife. And in terms of home gardeners, I mean, most of my friends are people who are as interested in native plants and wildlife as I am. So they have, native gardens.
I mean, I don't know whether it's, like you said, it's growing in popularity. Are you hopeful that people will adopt it more and more going forward?
Oh, I can see that it's being adopted. So I mean, I'm in the bush, but if I visit people in the burbs or even in a city and there are new gardens going in, majority of the time it's native plants. So especially young families, they are putting in native plants. They're getting to know native plants and contacting local councils. Local councils these days have lists of the plants that are local to that area and the ones that are suitable for using in your garden. So there's a lot of support and knowledge and information out there for people. So lots of different resources that they can get onto. So I really feel like the tide is turning slightly and there's much more interest in and knowledge of native plants.
Well, that's good to hear. And how about sourcing the plants? Is that easy to do?
Yeah, look, it sort of is and isn't. It is when you know where to go, which kind of sounds a bit weird. We have a lot of smaller volunteer-run Indigenous nurseries, and they're incredible wealth of information, and they grow thousands of plants every year, and you buy them in seedling form, so in tube stock form, so they're small, they're relatively cheap. A lot of councils will have giveaway with Indigenous plants, so you can go along to particular council days and get a voucher for 10, 20 Indigenous plants and then go to your local Indigenous nursery. And then we have got larger nurseries. So there's a number dotted around the country. One in Melbourne that is particularly amazing is called Karanga Native Nursery. It's 100% native plants, and people come into the nursery, and I worked there for a number of years, and they would come in, people who didn't know native plants, and they just couldn't believe their eyes when they saw the incredible diversity that were actually native plants. So I really feel like when people start to realise what native plants are, they're much more inclined to use them because they realise they're stunning. You know, they come in every colour you could possibly imagine. Some of them are subtle. Some of them are really out there. You know, you think of the waratahs and the banksias and the kangaroo paws. They are just really spectacular and unique. And then there's others which are sort of more the quiet achievers. So you've got all areas and all types of plants to be inspired by.
And if you were a designer, I mean, a lot of people who design or garden professionally need to try and get instant impact when they're building a garden or planting a garden. Is it possible to source kind of specimens at any sort of size? I'm just thinking of clients, you know, they might want instant bang for their buck, really. Is that possible to get mature specimens as well?
Absolutely it is. There are a number of wholesale growers that specialise in natives and grow larger stocks. So absolutely it is. I think sometimes when landscapers need a lot of plants all at once, it might be a problem, but there are certainly more and more wholesale growers that are growing native plants.
Okay, so you've mentioned some real sort of showstoppers there and some of the more quiet plants. What are your particular favourites that you garden with?
So in terms of Indigenous plants, we have got various correas. So they're sort of given the common name of native fuchsia. I really don't like putting the word native anything just because I feel like the plant deserves to be what it is in its own right. So these are correas, they're shrubs. They go from sort of ground covers through to 3-4 metre shrubs, and they're a staple around here. The flowers are high in nectar, so the honey eaters will come to them. They're also quite dense, so the little birds can come in and be protected. If you've got a bird bath nestled in there, the little birds feel really comfortable to come to it. So I will plant things like acacias. We have a number of Indigenous acacias around here, and again, they're really fantastic. So they're not as high in nectar as some of the like the eucalypts, etc., but they're high in pollen, so they're a really good source of that protein that the different animals need. So they're probably a couple of the main groups that I would plant. We have one grevillea which is native to the area, so that's one called Grevillea rosemarinifolia, so the rosemary grevillea. It's really dense and quite prickly, not overly prickly, but the little birds absolutely go nuts for it because, again, it has that real dense sort of prickly habit, and the birds can feed inside the bush in safety.
So, talking of little birds, in your book, which I've just read, you mentioned about the loss of small birds. Are there any species that you feel like are really under threat at the moment? And I think probably it is more in built-up areas. But then I was reading a stat that said 90% of Australians live in urban locations, so they are going to be of kind of prime concern when it comes to conserving wildlife.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like what we have here that have been hopping around the place, like the wrens, the superb wrens, the eastern spinebills, the pardalotes, you might get them in certain pockets in suburban areas. If they're close to a small parkland or bushland area, you might see them. But absolutely, they're under threat. And, on the one hand, it is possible to plant a garden that supports these smaller birds. But on the other hand, if they're not really in the area, they're not going to suddenly appear in your garden. If your garden is just like a bit of an oasis in a desert of roses and other sort of non-native plants. So we definitely need to consider them when we're planting, but certainly the larger birds like the magpies, the cockies, and some of the larger honey eaters, wattle birds, they are much more sort of gregarious and comfortable around people. So for them, being in the burbs is fantastic, and they have lots of opportunity for food. And in terms of native plants, like a lot of people will grow the large flowered grevilleas, and they are fantastic for the bigger honey eaters. Whereas I always say, if you're growing those grevilleas, fantastic because they're beautiful, but also grow the small flowered grevilleas so that the small birds can come in and be a bit protected as well. So I definitely think there is an imbalance in terms of small birds and medium-large birds in suburban areas, but it's not something that can't be overcome. But you need a decent number of people in your street, for example, who are going to be planting for wildlife.
Yeah. So we're talking about what gardeners can do at a wider level and thinking more top-down change. Is there anything else that you'd like to see happen?
Yeah, I'd definitely like to see more government support for not logging. I think that is absolutely a huge one. And this bizarre sort of assumption that by logging we're actually protecting the native forests, it absolutely doesn't work like that. So I also feel like, of course, we need progress, in inverted commas, and development, but I feel like that could be much better managed rather than developers essentially having carte blanche over what areas get developed without any thought given to the wildlife and flora that is there.
So again, thinking about wider trends within Australia, or maybe specifically this region, you said people are adopting native plants more. Are there any other kind of gardening trends that you're seeing at the moment?
I guess because it's my area that I work in, maybe I like to think that people are using more native plants, but certainly in my sort of circle, that's what I see. But there's also maybe a bit more of a trend towards growing home produce, so growing your own veggies and herbs, etc. at home. I think with the cost of living being what it is, people do want to have that sort of healthy, fresh produce at home. So I feel like that's a bit of a sort of trend on the rise, so to speak. But yeah, certainly native plants on the rise.
Brilliant. That's definitely music to my ears anyway. So if people wanted to follow your work, find out more about what you do, where would be the best places to go?
Yeah, so I have Instagram, which is the Habitat Guru, and I have obviously various posts there that are around habitat, and also Gardening Australia magazine. So I'm the hort editor there, and myself and the editor Elizabeth Wilson are really trying to bring in good change to the magazine, more diversity, more information about native plants, native gardens, wildlife, habitat, those sorts of things, because I really feel like that's what people are craving.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.